Are central banks making the same mistakes today as they did in 2021? And what are the risks that inflation might prove much more persistent and require higher interest rates than what's currently anticipated? Well, hello everyone, I'm Emma Reese from the Better Policy Project, and I'm filling in today for Yuri Chasford. And we are here today to explore these critical issues. As you may know, the financial markets have recently revised their estimates and are now projecting a neutral rate significantly higher than what's currently shown in the Fed's dot plot. This adjustment suggests that we may be underestimating the forces driving the economy at the moment, raising important questions about the adequacy of current monetary policy responses. Our discussion today will utilize the prudent risk management approach to monetary policy, in other words, FPAS Mark II, which is a sophisticated framework developed by the Better Policy Project and was launched in Armenia earlier this year. The system is tailored to proactively manage the risks associated with monetary policy. And guiding our discussion today, we have Douglas Laxton, who was a key figure in the development of global monetary policy frameworks in multiple countries around the world. Joining him, we have Charles Goodhart, who has a long and distinguished career working with the Bank of England. Is also known because of the Goodhart's Law. He was part of the first ever Monetary Policy Committee at the Bank of England in 1997. And last but not least, we have Shalva Matashvili, who manages both the Research Department and Monetary Policy Department at the National Bank of Georgia. Under Shalva's leadership, Georgia has successfully implemented FPAS Mark I and is currently developing FPAS Mark II, the prudent risk management approach to monetary policy. In today's panel, we will delve into whether the persistent natures of currently inflationary pressures and the revised expectation for neutral interest rates signal a pressing need for a strategic shift in monetary policy. We will discuss the potential oversights central banks may be making and the implications of these for global economic stability. With these significant points to cover, Douglas will begin by outlining the current inflation risks and the potential necessity for higher interest rates. You'll also touch on recent insights by Mervyn King, emphasizing the need for models that incorporate endogenous monetary policy credibility. So, Doug, the floor is yours.
Okay. So, welcome to the Charles Goodhart Hour and so on. So we have one speaker, Shelva, who will be arriving in 5 minutes and so on. And so the big question that we're going to try and ask today is, are central banks making a similar type of mistake today as they made during 2021? And in addition to that, we're also going to talk about, related to that, monetary policy frameworks, and specifically the prudent risk management approach to monetary policy that was developed at the Central Bank of Armenia over the last couple of years and launched in January of this year. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. Okay, but the first question that we're going to ask is what's going on now with inflation? And instead of getting into the 0.1s and the 0.2s and that sort of thing, we're going to try and take a big picture look at it initially. Later on in the seminar, we'll come back to this issue. But we can look at the screen right now. It's taken, the picture is taken from the latest Bank of England monetary policy report from May which has the expected paths of the policy rate in the United Kingdom, the US, and the Euro area. And what we want you to focus on is that US line, where you can see that the expected path of the policy rate at the end of the projection, in this case, is 4%. Okay. And so that is an estimate of the market's neutral interest rate. And so that number, that 4%, is substantially higher than what is in the Fed's dot plot, okay, which has been around 2.5% for years. I'm referring to the median estimate, but more recently, it has been revised up to 2.6, okay, like almost 150 basis points higher than what the Fed uh, tells us they think it is. This could potentially be very problematic, as Larry Summers has pointed out, because if the neutral interest rate is much higher, then it might take much higher interest rates to basically slow the US economy down to get inflation back to 2% and so on. Now, I'm very happy that Miriam is here. That she just released a working paper at the National Bank of Georgia that shows that the US, the standard US consumption function that features wealth, and I'm talking about the measure of wealth that is produced by the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. Okay, so they construct a measure of wealth every quarter that includes financial assets, and so you could just think of this as equity, bonds, and cash, and so on, as well as non-financial assets. So these are like properties, homes, and so on. And so that measure of financial assets has increased 50, 50, that's 50 trillion, that's trillion, so $50 trillion since the end of the first quarter of 2020 to the end of 23. And that massive increase in wealth, okay, which features in our consumption function, even though it has a very small elasticity of 0.01. There was an elasticity that would be consistent with thinking about the consumption function as a behavioral relationship. So this measure of wealth, we're not thinking about proxies for confidence, or we're talking about the structural type of elasticity where when people take all their wealth and maybe they retire, they turn it into an income stream to support consumption and so on. So inside this $50 trillion increase in wealth, there was a doubling in the S&P and a 50% increase in property prices, with a further 10% increase in the S&P since the end of last year. When we observe the release of the next estimates of wealth by the Federal Reserve Board in a couple of weeks, there will be another several $1 trillion increase in financial assets. And this, of course, can explain why consumption has been so strong, that basically consumers are flush not only with liquidity, but they have a massive amount of wealth that they consume out of over the next several years and so on. So thanks, Miriam, for that wonderful research that helps us to explain why the US has not had a recession. Now, of course, we have a theory that we use that I think Charles ascribes to. It's called endogenous money creation. And so when we think of what banks do in the economy, they do not collect deposits and lend them out. When banks make loans to people and make credit available, they create money or purchasing power as a result of that process of creating loans. Now, the problem is that after those loans are created and that money is created, we don't know what happens to it. Really, as economists, if we knew that, and we knew exactly what happened to the money that was created, then our problems would be very straightforward. Now, what we do know, though, is that money is used to purchase consumption goods, it's used to purchase investment goods, and it's also used to purchase existing assets like equities and housing. So we know there's enough money out there to finance all of those purchases at super high asset price values, like the S&P doubling and so on, and property prices doubling. So we know that. But of course, endogenous money creation also tells us that if perceptions for the economy were to suddenly change, if there were going to be a correction in asset prices, that we could also have consumption and weakening from the very same mechanisms that allowed it to increase. So perceptions of the future as are reflected in asset prices do have implications for real behavior. Okay, so I wanted to note that. Now, the problem is if the neutral interest rate is 4% and not 2.5%, that has potentially very catastrophic implications because the current 10-year interest rate, which is currently 4.5%, if the term premium, which is appropriate for that 10-year interest rate, which is currently zero, approximately zero, if that term premium were to snap back to the 1% level that was observed during the Great Moderation, that would take 10-year bond rates up to 5% plus. And that could give rise to a perception of unstable debt dynamics. Now, if the term premium were to snap back to 2%, which is what it was during the period where inflation was approximately 4 or 5% from the mid 80s up until the period where the Great Moderation began, that would result in a 10-year bond rate of 6%. And 6% might very well be close to the threshold where there could be a perception of a fiscal crisis in the US. In other words, a perception that fiscal dynamics are unstable and that the US is incapable of generating. They're currently running a 2.5% primary deficit. If the interest rate were to rise to 6%, they would have to change that deficit into a massive fiscal surplus. And the question is, could the Democrats and the Republicans get together and agree to raise taxes by that much or to cut expenditures? So if the market thought that they couldn't, then obviously the bond vigilantes would demand even higher term premium and so on. So we're in a very potentially dangerous situation with higher neutral interest rates. There's also an issue, in a world of integrated capital markets, if the neutral interest rate in the US is 4%, then the question is, why do we have lower interest rates in places like the United Kingdom and Euro area? And one possible explanation for that is that their inflation dynamics. This is what Governor Bailey of the Bank of England has said, that the inflation dynamics are different in the United Kingdom and so on. And so we've obviously been looking at that when we look at our favorite measures of inflation, non-traded sticky price inflation, which we've created at the Central Bank of Armenia and the National Bank of Georgia. We've tried to create that measure of inflation for the United Kingdom, but found that it was virtually impossible. There's not enough data that's readily available that would allow researchers to quickly develop such a measure. Now, the best proxy for that measure of inflation, non-traded sticky price inflation, would be service prices. Again, we take a chart from the Bank of England, and we see that when we look on a year-on-year basis, it's about 4% in the United States, it's about 4% in the euro area, and it's 6%. We tried to dig into the data, ran into all kinds of problems in the United Kingdom trying to get higher frequency measures. They finally published a seasonally adjusted series in the last monetary policy report, but there's issues at the Bank of England in basic things like data quality, how it's reported, how it's documented. But they do have a measure that they published in the May report that shows that on a 3-month over 3-month basis, this service price inflation has come down substantially. Now, what we would like is obviously much more data published on the Bank of England website that allowed us to dig down and so on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the what we call FPAS Mark II, or the prudent risk management approach to monetary policy, and how it differs from FPAS Mark I, which was the first generation of forecasting and policy analysis systems that were developed in central banks. It all started at the Bank of Canada when we developed FPAS Mark I. It's rather interesting because even though we developed FPAS Mark I, it was not the thing that prompted us to announce inflation targeting after New Zealand did it in 1990. And so in Mervyn King's speech, okay, which we're going to get into in a second here, he says something very important and very true, that the seeds, the ideas of inflation targeting wasn't really about inflation targeting. It was more about reforming many different types of policies in New Zealand. And by the time they got to the Reserve Bank in New Zealand, they asked them, what do you guys do? And they said, price stability. And they said, what's that? And then, of course, then the journey began trying to define what price stability is, like what was a numerical target. So by 1990, they had announced a target for inflation. Canada, but they didn't have a framework, as we're going to talk about here. We're going to talk about the journey for developing a framework and so on. The Canadians did have a framework, but that's not what prompted them. It wasn't the discovery of the framework that that caused them to announce inflation targeting. It was because of an agreement between the governor of the Bank of Canada, Governor Crow, and the Minister of Finance. So what had happened is that during the disinflation in the early 1980s, unemployment had gone up to double digits. The budgets had gone into massive deficits. And this happened in many countries and so on. And so we had a real debt problem, partly because we didn't do a very good job coordinating monetary and fiscal policy. So in the early 1990s, we had successfully brought inflation down to the 4 or 5% range, but Governor Crow wanted to go for price stability. He wanted zero. And the problem is that the government was about to give wage settlements to government workers that would have embodied 4 or 5% inflation premium. So you can imagine if the Bank of Canada would have gone for zero and the government would have given 4% inflation premium to government workers, it would have been a disaster. You can imagine, what the public would have thought about about something like that. So conflict between monetary and fiscal policy. How did we come up with two? Well, price stability 0, 4% around what we had then. 0 plus 4 divided by 2 is 2. So it was a compromise, 2%. And what's amazing is that 2% inflation target stuck. Now, the story, because we had developed FPAS Mark 1. Now, what is FPAS Mark 1? It's effectively organizing the central bank's resources. And this is like the surveillance, the modeling, the projection, and so on, along the lines of three essential ingredients. Where is the economy today? What are the underlying forces in the economy? Those questions are very much related. In other words, if the economy has excess demand today, and if we expect those excess demand forces to be persistent in the future, then of course, where the economy is going is connected to where the economy is today. But lastly, and most importantly, is what do we need to do with our instruments to achieve our objectives? And so this was my experience convincing people at the Bank of Canada that we could actually develop a modeling framework that was credible enough, that our view about the transmission mechanism was rich enough to capture the ideas that they thought about when they thought about the transmission mechanism, was let's just say a big accomplishment because people were very, very skeptical that central banks could do this. Now, one thing that was really important that we had learned that I think many other central banks didn't is that when we used models, we didn't use them to get answers to questions. We didn't say the model says and things like that. We use models to help us think about uncertainty, uncertainty about the monetary transmission mechanism, so that we could have a really rich discussion about monetary policy and all those uncertainties about where is the economy today, what are the underlying forces, and of course the transmission mechanism, what do we need to do with our instruments to achieve our objectives. And so many institutions going through that process of developing, the Bank of England's still doing it, so is the Bank of Japan and ECB. So they don't have this FPAS Mark 1 framework still to this day, whereas Canada introduced it in the early 1990s. I then went to the research department of the IMF, and the very first call I got was from the Reserve Bank of New Zealand. And so I went there for a week, mapped out a project for them, taught this guy named Alistair Scott, who was there at the time, how to think about building a little model and to show people that this wasn't rocket science at all. He later went to the Bank of England, and I was expecting that he was going to fix things up there. But the problem is that after he left, it looked like nothing had changed at all for the reasons that I'm going to get into later. Okay, so what is a non-FS central bank? Well, they don't have these three essential ingredients that I talked about earlier. They can't do scenario analysis or uncertainty analysis, because to be able to do that in a sensible way, you have to have the three essential ingredients. And then lastly, you can't do least regrets policies, or what we describe in our new framework at the Central Bank of Armenia as the prudent risk management approach to doing monetary policy. So FPAS Mark 1, we can do some of those things. So we have the three essential ingredients. We tried to take a stab under FPAS Mark 1 about doing scenario analysis, but we never really did, I think, justice to thinking about the implications of uncertainty, at least as far as communicating with the outside world and so on. So that's where things stand there. Now, this seminar was prompted by, thanks to Charles, by referring me to this talk that Mervyn King was giving at the Riksbank, and I just wanted to say that for the record, we disagree enormously with King's analysis. We disagree a lot with his view of history. We think he needs to look to see what has happened in the central banking world, developing these FPAS Mark I and Mark II frameworks. And the reason is that they're now the majority. They're no longer the minority that he could claim 20 years ago. Most central banks have either developed an FPAS Mark I framework, and some of them are, like the National Bank of Georgia, are working on developing Mark II. So what does he say? Central banks were assumed to have perfect credibility, he's talking about in central banks, irrespective of the actions they took, or equivalently, inflation expectations are determined by the inflation target. Okay. We need models in which the credibility of a central bank is endogenous to its actions. The assumption that expectations are determined by the target is misleading at best and dangerous at worst. We agree 100% with the second part. And that's why we've developed models over the last 30 years that had endogenous monetary policy credibility. So we've created a special web page that's called Endogenous Monetary Policy Credibility, where we go through all the papers that we wrote over the last 30 years since the development of the framework at the Bank of Canada in the early 1990s. Those models incorporate all the insights that he's mentioned. They incorporate the idea that credibility is a stock. It's easier to lose than to gain once you've lost it, and so on. And so it satisfies what he's talking about. Where I disagree, and there's going to be a number of areas that we disagree with. We won't cover all of them right now. This is from an interview that he did a couple of years ago, where he made the same points, that the reason that central banks messed up during COVID is that they were infected by these models that presumed that inflation expectations were anchored. And they asked him in the interview, do you blame central banks for this? And he said, no, I blame the profession because they were infected by these models that presume the system would always be anchored. Now, the problem with that logic is that if you think that central bankers can get infected by the profession, you need to have very high levels of transparency and accountability. And he doesn't draw that connection that if he believes that they were infected, we need to have much higher levels of transparency and accountability and so on. The other part that is really worrisome is the part where in the first paragraph, he goes, central banks were assumed to have perfect credibility irrespective of the actions they took, or equivalently, inflation expectations are determined by the inflation target. Well, I think that criticism actually applies much more strongly to the Bank of England and their practice of producing forecasts based on exogenous paths for the interest rate, for the policy rate. And I'm going to try and explain that and so on. So the Bank of England, for many, many years, I'll ask Charles actually when they started this, because we couldn't find all the historical inflation reports. But historically, as far back as we can see, they produced these forecasts for inflation that are based on constant interest rates and market interest rates. Okay, I'm going to talk about the constant interest rates first because it's easier to understand the intuition for the argument. Under FPAS Mark I, this would be illegal And it would be illegal because in our frameworks for FPAS Mark 1, the way we define policy is a commitment to adjust the instrument sufficiently aggressively to anchor inflation and inflation expectations. So if you had an exogenous path for the interest rate and inflation returned back to the target magically, it wouldn't be consistent with having a model that was consistent with the principle that you had to adjust the interest rate over time. Milton Friedman, in 1968, in his famous presidential address, where he talked about how central banks would be unwise to try to peg the interest rate. The example that he gave, and it wasn't just Milton Friedman, this was understood well before even Friedman's presidential address, that if you tried to peg the interest rate, so in the chart, the interest rate in this case, I think was 1 or 2%. This was in the early stages of COVID, where they produced this, I don't know what you'd call it, a scenario, I guess, that inflation returns back to the target from double-digit rates with an interest rate of 1 or 2%. I think, Charles, in the press, you described this as the miraculous 2% or something like that. I recall reading that. But the reason why this is illegal is that if the interest rate were pegged at 1 or 2% and inflation was in the double digits, the real interest rate would be negative. Okay. And then the question would be, well, that negative real interest rate would be stimulating the economy. And what monetary policy is supposed to be doing its job to raise interest rates to contain inflationary pressures. So what would happen if the central bank tried to do this? And Milton Friedman argued that you'd either get inflation running out of control or potentially even deflation. It depends on what the environment was. So this chart is actually, and all related analysis to it, is illegal under FPAS, any FPAS central bank, Mark 1 or Mark 2. Now, there's another chart, which is with the market's expectation of the interest rate. It suffers from exactly the same problem. I think it's worse because it gives the impression of plausibility, okay? Whereas it's still not answering the question that we need to address, which is in any scenario, where is the economy today? What are the underlying forces in that scenario? And of course, what do we need to do with our instruments to achieve our objectives? Now, importantly, 30 years ago at the Bank of Canada, we thought of policy much like it's thought of at the Bank of England today. We thought about setting the policy rate, and that sometimes we'd even mistakenly call that the policy. Whereas today, the way that we think about monetary policy is that those 8 times that we set the policy rate, we take those 8 times as opportunities to not only set the policy rate, but to communicate how we're thinking about monetary policy. In other words, where is the economy today? What are the underlying forces, and what do we need to do with our instruments to achieve our objectives, and so on. So I wanted to go back to Charles and ask, because he joined the Monetary Policy Committee, the history of the Bank of England and how they adopted inflation targeting is quite a bit different than most of the central banks like Canada and New Zealand that had central bank independence and so on. So when the United Kingdom was thrown off the ERM in 1992, they were one of many central banks that were thrown into the inflation targeting world. And at that point, the Chancellor of the Exchequer was running monetary policy. The term inflation report comes from the Bank of England writing a report on inflation, not being responsible for inflation, but simply commenting on it. And so what had happened by 1997 is that they'd realized, and this is looking at data on long-term inflation expectations from comparing the yields on conventional bonds and index bonds. So inflation expectations 10 years ahead was substantially higher than the upper end of the range. And so in May 1997, the Chancellor of the Exchequer wisely figured out that central bank independence was absolutely vital, that a point target for inflation was absolutely vital, and that lastly, they needed to have a monetary policy committee that would be responsible for adjusting the instruments sufficiently aggressively to anchor inflation, long-term inflation target, long-term inflation expectations at the new point target. Quite remarkably, within 9 months, long-term inflation expectations from the bond market had fallen to the 2.5% target. Subsequent work by Andy Levin and co-authors looked at these data as well as data for other countries and concluded that not only did they become anchored to the point target, but they became insensitive to information that was driving short-term inflation expectations down. So I wanted to ask Charles, because he started at the Bank of England. He was a part of the very first monetary policy committee. What was it like there? In other words, how did they think about models? How did they think about organizing themselves in the early days of this flexible inflation targeting regime? And that's effectively started in May 1997.
Well, thank you very much, Doug. Can I just say a few other quick words?
Of course, yeah.
First, when New Zealand adopted the inflation target, the RBNZ actually asked me to be an external advisor. They also had asked Carl Brunner, I think it was, and David Laidler, but neither of them could go, so I was the main external advisor. Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the reasons why we chose a relatively small inflation figure as a sort of the centerpiece of the range was, first of all, there'd been, I think you probably remember it, but my memory is going, a report relatively earlier saying that the inflation figures were overstated because they didn't take enough account of quality improvements. So that something like 1 or 2% was overstated, so that if you took account of quality adjustments, a sort of 1.5 or 2% figure was actually not far off in real terms, actual price stability. Another factor was the point that I think it was Jim Tobin used to make, which is that if you went down to zero, there would be occasions on which to hold inflation at zero, you would have to introduce nominal wage cuts. And one thing that, again, is well known is that there's nothing that workers hate more than having their wages actually cut in nominal terms. And so there was a sort of feeling that in order to make the sort of smooth out the sort of labor markets, it was better to have a small inflation target rather than a zero inflation target. I might add that when we were doing this work for the RBNZ, and imagine you were doing it for Canada, there was no thought at all that we were going to find that we would hit the lower, the zero bound, or the effective lower bound. That was not at all in our minds. One thing that, again, you were talking about particular future inflation in America. And you didn't mention the politics of the increases in tariffs and the cutbacks in migration that it seems that both parties are going to introduce, which are likely to be inflationary. Nor did you mention one of the things that's increasingly worrying me is the effect of climate change on agriculture and therefore on food prices. As a result of those factors, I think that it is actually quite likely that in 2025 that we could get inflation rising again. The problem then is that if you have a period of rising inflation and the central bank is trying to deal with that by rising interest rates, it's extraordinarily hard to sell debt, public sector debt, treasury bonds, in the context of rising interest rates. That means that we could get a situation in which the government either tries to get the central bank to come in and support the bond market through QE, or if the central bank steadfastly refuses, you could have a bond market crisis. Either would, I think, be very difficult. And that leads to, I think that the economic problems in the US and indeed the West as a whole in 2025 could look really quite difficult. Now, you then talked about the assumptions, the interest rate assumptions that the Bank of England used. Everyone knew and still knows that a constant interest rate assumption leads to totally stupid results. The reason it was done was not that anyone ever thought that this was likely to happen. It would simply be to show what would happen if you did this. And clearly, when the situation is such that the expectation is that interest rates will have to change really quite a lot, no one pays any attention to the sort of the results that are set out for constant interest rates. I was slightly surprised to see your claim.
But Charles, I'm confused here because you said what would happen, and like this chart has inflation returning back to the target based on constant interest rates. So I don't understand. Like you're saying the results are like it's nonsense.
No, but
it still is.
If we're in the current position, what we've got is a interest rate of 5.25, which would be sufficient to, or is thought to be sufficient, to produce downwards pressure on the economy, sufficient to lead to inflation coming down. Indeed, there would be a concern that quite a lot of the members of the MPC would have at the moment, that if you kept interest rates at 5.25, you might get a bit of a recession, and that output would fall well below the natural rate. And at the moment, the inflations of 5.25 aren't too bad.
I understand at the moment, but back during COVID, okay, if the interest rate is at this low level and you show this chart to a politician and they look at it and say, well, your analysis suggests that if you don't do anything, inflation will return to the target. Like why publish that? Why, like that's what I'm curious about.
Well, in most years, no one pays any attention to the constant interest rate assumption at all. It's just there for the record because it was started off. No one pays much attention to it. The one that people pay attention to is the market expectations. Now, I was actually rather surprised by your reaction that you thought it was very bad, because it is actually exactly the same as what you want to introduce under FPAS 2, as the market expectations that the commercial banks have about what might happen to interest rates. Under FPAS-2, as I understand it, you would have this central interest rate set up, which would come from what the commercial banks think. And then you have scenarios on both sides. Now, the market expectations is exactly what you were thinking of as the central sort of initial position for your FPAS-2. Now, I entirely agree with the desirability of forecast, of having scenarios, but it's exactly the same as you want to introduce.
No.
Well, you told me.
Because let me explain. Okay, so when we do FPAS Mark II, okay, we construct what is referred to as a market reference scenario. Okay, and so
That's
what that
exactly
market
what this is. That's exactly.
So wait. So that what that market reference scenario is to try to come up with a set of assumptions that are consistent with what the expectations are in the market.
That's exactly what this is. Absolutely
Okay.
exactly. It's exactly the same.
Okay, but Charles, that is a very small point. Okay, the more important point
not a small
is
point.
that is then used as a frame of reference to talk about the types of scenarios where we have to adjust the interest rates from those market expectations.
Yeah, look, let me go into this a bit more.
Okay, go ahead.
One of the reasons why the Bank of England did this as a sort of frame for expectations was that they didn't want to set out a policy objective as their own, because then everybody would expect them to follow it. If you set out as Sweden and some of the countries, Norway and now New Zealand, we were always scared that this would be regarded as a sort of quasi-commitment. Because what the people who are using forecasts, not the people who are making them, but the users want, is to be told, given information, given more certainty about what will happen. And if the forecast is said to be what the central bank thinks itself, or the Monetary Policy Committee, then this turns out into much more of a commitment than the Bank of England ever wanted to have. And so that was why a market expectations was chosen, rather than having it to be the policy objective of the Bank the Bank of England in itself. And remember also that Mervyn King was very keen that this should be accompanied by the fan charts,
right,
showing that the outcomes were likely to be potentially very wide. And also, one of the things that the Bank of England and the MPC wanted to do was to indicate that if the market expectations, according to the forecast, were not going to bring the inflation back to the 2% target, that meant that the MPC and the bank thought that the market were wrong.
Okay, so the first thing is we've developed FPAS Mark I frameworks in many central banks, and they all had to overcome this idea that somehow the market was going to misinterpret this, that we're going to be committed to this line, and that there's no evidence whatsoever. The central banks that all implemented FPAS Mark I, that argument was overblown. Okay, but the second thing is that if that is your interpretation of what the Bank of England is doing, they should write that. They should say, like we say in Mark II, that we are creating a market reference scenario. Has nothing to do with policy. It's simply just a calculation that we do. We have a model, which the Bank of England doesn't, but we have a model, which the Bank of England doesn't, I might add, that they're on record now in the Bernanke report and so on. that allows us to think about taking information and there's no policy in it whatsoever. It's just asking what is the reference scenario, and it's a reference scenario. It has nothing to do with policy. The policy comes from the policymakers looking at that and then deciding whether or not they think they should nudge market interest rates up relative to that scenario or down, and so on. So, I accept your point. If that's your interpretation of what the Bank of England does, totally on board. But I don't see how it helps. And in fact, I think it actually hurts. But Shelva, can you please, you have a question or a comment to make?
Yes, thank you. I have a question to both of you. My understanding is that publishing this type of analysis can help two things. One is simply providing a forecast. Whoever may be interested in how inflation would behave, like just providing a forecast and that's it, period. The other can be the central bank publishing something that conveys about the future, how central bank reacts to different types of evolution of its key variables like inflation. In short, providing a sense of reaction function. So in my understanding, having these scenarios about future can serve these two purposes, like providing just the forecast and saying something about reaction function. Now, my question would be, which type of aim is meant for the Bank of England to achieve with this type of analysis, and which of these two aims is more important for a central bank?
So Charles, I think that might be to you, but.
Well, the Bernanke report actually suggested, as far as I can make out, that the bank takes something which is pretty close to your FPAS Mark II. And I like your FPAS Mark II. It's just that I don't think you want to be quite so critical about where they are at the moment. No, and I agree that the Bernanke report said you should de-emphasize the central framework and do much more in the way of scenarios. And I think that's right. One of the difficulties is actually doing that and de-emphasizing the central, because as I say, the people who are trying to use the forecasts want to use them in order to give themselves greater certainty about what's likely to happen in markets. And that makes it quite difficult to de-emphasize the central forecast. And I very much like exactly what Doug is trying to do, with simply saying that this is a sort of basic framework. What we're going to do is do scenarios on either side. And that's what Bernanke is actually suggesting, and what I hope the Bank of England will do. Essentially, I'm on your side, Doug. It's just that I don't want you to be unfairly critical of what the Bank of England has done.
Okay, so let me explain, what the FPAS Mark I central banks have done, and they haven't all done it correctly, in my view. There's lots of problems that I have with the FPAS Mark I central banks that aren't quite as serious as the non-FPAS central banks, but this is how the Czech National Bank did it, so this is just an example of a forecast made in August of 2008. I love this one because obviously the global financial crisis really struck with the collapse of Lehman Brothers on September 15th of 2008. So this was just before the global financial crisis and so on. And you remember the ECB was raising interest rates, because actual inflation was really high. Oil prices had just hit $150 in July of 2008 and so on. What the Czechs did, and I want to explain this because, and that's why I asked, for documentation and so on, about what it is where the central bank is actually producing. In the preamble of the Czech monetary policy report, it would say very clearly that this forecast is drawn up by the Monetary Policy Department, was locked in, okay, a week or two before the actual decision. In other words, did not have the decision in it, okay? And it was used importantly as a frame of reference from which the board could have a rich discussion about how their views differed from this particular scenario and so on. And so obviously when they were in agreement with the basic thrust of the scenario, they would follow what effectively the forward guidance in the scenario was. Now, let me be really clear. In August of 2008, everybody was facing high inflation. You can see it in the chart, okay? Actual inflation was quite high. They knew that in the year-on-year calculation, that there were going to be some price increases that were falling out of that calculation. So they were pretty sure about that those things would be falling out. They also had not a crystal ball, consensus forecasts for the global economy, but for Germany in particular, which they're very dependent on. And those forecasts had the global economy slowing down. So they had nothing special in terms of having a special crystal ball. They had consensus forecasts. And on the basis of that, because they're an open economy, they were projecting that underlying inflation would decline, that growth would fall. And as a result of that, the path for the policy rate was going to create a tendency for it to decline over time. And that's how they interpreted it. There was no misunderstanding in any of these forecasts that the markets, that they were going to be committed to following this line. This is in reference to Shelva's point. They were trying to communicate the reaction of monetary policy, that in response to new information, that they were committed to adjusting their forecast over time and so on. So I just wanted to say that, if the Bank of England's framework, okay, like producing this forecast based on market interest rates, if that's your interpretation, I'm totally okay with it. But it's missing the more fundamental point about what is monetary policy and how do I communicate how monetary policy is responding to information. So using the monetary policy report to explain in a systematic way, when you have any particular scenario, what's the appropriate policy response into that, in response to that scenario. So I don't disagree with you, but and if that's your interpretation of what they do, fine. I do disagree that somehow markets are going to take it as a commitment. They might initially, and of course, if people in markets are betting and taking that as a commitment, they're going to be sadly disappointed. So the decisions that they make are going to be wrong, and the central bank's not. It can do its best to communicate what it's trying to do, but if people make mistakes, not understanding what the central bank is doing, we can either fix the communications of the central bank or effectively just keep practicing and doing the right thing. And the people that are not understanding what the central bank is doing will effectively be punished by the markets and so on, because they'll be getting it wrong. So I don't. I don't see. Let me put the question this way: why are you defending what the Bank of England's doing? Like, you seem to be defending this market interest rate assumption. I mean, I don't understand. It's at best, it's just a starting point for starting off the discussions about monetary policy. No,
I agree. It is a starting point. But it's not necessarily a bad starting point, and you can tell a fair amount from that starting point. And the great problem is that if you're in a central bank, the one thing that you're really very, very much aware of is how uncertain everything is, and how lots of things can happen. The problem that you face, and this is a communication problem as much as anything else, is that what people who are using the forecasts that you put out, they are trying to get much more certainty, much more information than is actually present in a forecast. And we just don't know what the future is going to be. And that's why I'm very, very strongly in favor of your scenarios that says if X, then Y, if A, then B. And that's a better way of communicating than having something like the check policy thing there. Because what the press and the market do when you get something like the check line that you got there is they just concentrate on the central forecast and they forget everything else.
Okay, I have another question related to transparency and so on. Okay, so constructing the line. Okay, for us to construct the line, we have to have a model. In other words, what we're trying to do is to ask, based on a view of the transmission mechanism and all the information that's in the market, what are the shocks driving the economy, or the interpretation of the shocks by people in the market that would be consistent with market expectations. Bank of England doesn't publish a model, okay, that explains how you would go about doing that. We do, okay? What did the Bank of England do to produce these forecasts? Because our models wouldn't allow us to even create these forecasts with exogenous market interest rates.
The Bank of England has loads of models. Every central bank, or most central banks, have loads of models. I've just been listening to a discussion about the ECB. The ECB has got about 6 different models and sub-models, and models that are sort of subsidiary to other models. And we all have loads of models. The Bank of England's got loads of models. And to say they don't, and it's just incorrect to say they don't have models. They've got, the models may not be the best. And as Bernanke said in his review, that the models haven't been kept up properly and are not as good as they should be. But they've certainly got models. And as everybody knows, models are simplifications which are always or often, and particularly when things are changing quite rapidly, models are almost always in these kind of crisis conditions are insufficient. So that what you have to do is you have to support models with judgment. No central bank ever uses a model without applying judgment to what that model actually suggests. And I'm sure, and I would hope, that when you do your FPAS with your scenarios, that the scenarios not only include the model, but include judgments about how the model is working relative to current developments. And one of the things that Mervyn King said in his paper, which I do recommend actually everybody reads, is that what you need, including for scenarios, is a good narrative. You've got to try and understand where you are, and models help you in doing that. No doubt about it, they help you a lot, but they're not sufficient by themselves.
I would agree with that 100%. In fact, that's what we've taught everybody. I think the problem is that the way they view models in those institutions is not like we view models. We view models as organizational devices, but at the end of the day, we have a model to explain to people what a core model to explain what are the core essential ingredients in that model, and how do we then use that model with judgment, importantly. Okay.
I agree with you.
So I don't
I think
disagree, but I'd like to see one model, a core model that explains what it is how the central bank actually views the economy and the uncertainty in the economy. That's the
so
issue that I have.
the problem is that different models give you different results, and you have to judge which model is nearer the truth. And again, the ECB, and I would actually suggest that some of you go and listen to the video that I've just been attending, because for example, in the ECB, there is a difference between the top-down model, which takes the EU as a whole, and the bottom-up model, which looks at the individual countries and works from the individual countries to the aggregate. And the bottom-up model is called the ECMB, and the top-down model is called the NAWN, as I recall it. And essentially, at the end of the day, you're going to be faced with different models that give you different answers. And you're going to have to choose which you think is nearer the truth, using your judgment about that.
The thing that you're not accepting here, okay, is that none of those models, I think, are admissible, because none of those the models that you can solve with exogenous interest rates, okay, don't have this fundamental principle on them that monetary policy has to adjust instruments sufficiently aggressively to anchor inflation and inflation expectations. That's the problem about what is an admissible model. Okay, so I'm not saying they don't have models. They don't have models that are admissible models that incorporate that insight, and they don't make those models available to people. And I'm not claiming that they should use judgment. We showed the world how to do this stuff. And so obviously a judgment was a very important thing. And of course, top down, bottom up, absolutely no problem. Fundamentally a part of our methodology. But the point that we're disagreeing about is what is an admissible model. And an admissible model has to have the role of monetary policy in it to talk about things like how you organize the forecast process, and how do you study uncertainty and differences in views about all those things. And so that's the part that I'm confused about.
It's not that easy, Doug. And the reason it's not that easy is because one of the things that you don't know is whether something is going to continue, and whether the latest information you've got is, maybe it's a bump, maybe it's a result of some kind of statistical thing. So that it's all very well to talk about a model with endogenous interest rates, but how do you endogenize them? Because you can't assume that the central bank will react immediately, nor probably should it, given how uncertain the flow of statistics is. So when do you assume that the central bank reacts to the current data? And again, look at what's happening in the US at the moment. The US doesn't know whether things are going to become more inflationary or less inflationary, and it's going to wait for the data to tell it. In other words, depending on what happens, they're probably going to be late. They're inevitably going to be late. So if you're going to endogenize the interest rates, which is splendid, but you've got to have, among other things, a view, empirical, theoretical, whatever you like, as to the nature of the endogeneity.
Okay. So we can explain to you how we did that at the Bank of Canada, as well as numerous central banks around the world. Okay. We use what is called, up until recently, an inflation forecast based reaction function. Okay. And this was developed in the late 1980s by myself at the Bank of Canada. It was a very much an important part, well, the most important part of FPAS Mark 1, because people at the Bank of Canada asked exactly the question that you're asking now, and we had to come up with a good answer for it. So the inflation forecast-based reaction function was special in the sense that it was forward-looking. It had the year-on-year inflation rate 3 quarters into the future. What's special about that? Well, the inflation rate year on year, 3 quarters in the future includes pi t plus 3, pi t plus 2, pi t plus 1, and pi t. And it was found by examining a bunch of models, nonlinear models, not linear models. So nonlinear models that had many of these insights that we're talking about today, recognizing all the uncertainty that you're referring to. And the types of reaction functions that we found that were the most robust had a weight on the forecast, which of course is bogus for the reasons that you described, but also a little bit of feedback on actual inflation outcomes. That was the pi t. That's what got us into the game. If you talk to people at the Bank of Canada, interestingly, who were just as skeptical as you are about this, they will tell you that this equation was the least add factored equation in the model. So this whole issue, now of course there's judgment that goes on to that that interest rate as well. Now today we have upped the game by using objective functions to construct paths for the interest rate and paths for the economy under a range of assumptions, not using a reaction function, but an objective function. But I should ask Shelva. He runs the National Bank of Georgia. And so he's been implementing FPAS Mark 1 for several years. And so maybe he has some views about how you add judgment and how you use these models with an endogenous interest rate to do policy analysis. Please, Shelva.
So I think the key point is the one that I've mentioned in my question, which is how to communicate the reaction function. And the reaction function that policymakers have is much more complex than any model can capture. But at least the model that we have is kind of gives you some structure to incorporate judgment into. And that's why it's probably better to say that it's like not the core model, in broader terms. It's not the core model that should have this endogenous policy reaction. Like technically, that's what we need. Otherwise, you can't really run a model which can help you in understanding how policy should react. But in broader terms, the system should have like an endogenous interest, like the overall system, even suite of models or the processes that are meant to help us in discussing model results, coming up with different types of judgments and incorporating this judgment. This process should be somehow centered around the idea that the policy reaction is endogenous. And having a model that has this endogenous policy rate technically also forces the economist itself to realize that the policy response should also be endogenous, and also how to communicate that the policy response is endogenous. I think that's the having a model where there is an equation or there's an objective function is a technical part, but it helps this broader aim of communicating that policy is endogenous and communicate how you react to different types of information. You actually also mentioned like in terms of how we approach this, so we have very similar inflation forecast based reaction function. It has served us quite well up until this point. And you also mentioned this kind of a potential threat of financial markets misreading our publication of policy rate reaction. In our case, we still publish baseline forecast, and within our baseline forecast, how we react to inflation developments in the near term, and how policy rates should be changed in the forecast horizon to push inflation towards its target. There was this kind of a fear that financial markets, when we publish policy rate projection, financial markets will take this as a commitment on the side of the central bank. This was indeed something that we did fear, but we still went ahead, and to this date, I have not seen much of complaints from the financial markets. If anything, now we see a couple big banks which are actually expanding in the region, so that they are becoming quite big. They have big influence in the domestic economy. They have started to come up with their own scenarios. And this is probably something that our policy reaction function communication has helped, because now they understand based on their own assumptions about how inflation will behave in the future, which might be different than what our baseline forecast incorporates. Based on their own assumptions, they have a better idea how we will react to these type of developments. And this is helpful because it means that financial markets are quicker to incorporate any extra information that they have. And they might have some extra information. They have a relationship with micro businesses, big businesses. They understand when they extend loans, they know this micro level information much better. So if they have better information, and if they incorporate this information into their own inflation forecast, into their own GDP forecast, and at the same time they understand how we will react to this, then financial market expectations of interest rates, long-term interest rates, would be quicker to react to these new developments. And that's kind of a type of automatic stabilizer. Of course, we need to follow through. And if things really turn out as the financial market expects, then we need to be consistent. We need to follow the reaction function that we have communicated before to the financial market. If indeed inflation follows the path that financial market expected, and they had some idea how we would react, then we should be reacting in the same way if we want to be consistent. And having this kind of a model that has this endogenous interest rate in it helps us to follow this kind of a consistency. I think that that's kind of a bottom line.
I think, Charles, like what you said, that models give different answers and that sort of thing. I think that nailed it on the head. Okay. I think that the people that have not done this FPAS stuff think about it that way. They suffer a little bit from the model says. Okay. And so when we talk about the forecast and the reaction function, we think of that reaction function as being problematic. We think of everything being problematic. Okay. That's why we don't follow models blindly. That's why we add tremendous amounts of judgment onto all of the modeling assumptions. But that's why we also want to be transparent about what we're adding and so on. So that's what we're trying to get to here. So, we don't buy into this idea that you have a whole bunch of models and you say, what do they say? What we do is we use models as organizational devices, a core model in particular, so that we can study the implications of uncertainty as opposed to blindly following what the model says. So I think actually all the non-FPAS central banks that I can think of suffer from that problem. They've never escaped that kind of idea that we had when we're in academia, that we build models and we see what implications they have. That's something we do as academics, but as professionals, we recognize all those uncertainties. We recognize the important role of judgment and many things that are outside of the model. So I don't buy that argument that somehow the models give different answers and you can't agree on the model. That is taking us into the non-FPAS world. That's the problem why people get stuck in the non-FS world, that they don't learn how to live with uncertainty about all these things, but yet still have the strength of a systematic policy rule in there, which I think is what we've overcome a little bit in the FPAS Mark I world. Now, we agree with you that it needed to be improved, that thinking about policy, the policy rate path as being something that we try to fine tune and so on is a bad idea, that we need to think much more about also guarding against dark corners where long-term inflation expectations are allowed to ratchet up, where inflation premium can be built into wage and price setting behavior. So that's not about, just what does the model say, how many basis points is the model saying. That's about using the model more as an organizational device to understand and study uncertainty. So that seems to be a big difference between non-FPAS central banks and FPAS central banks. But do you disagree?
I
How
let
I've
me start by
characterized it?
saying that I think that your FPAS 2 is a considerable improvement on what you describe as the non-FPAS sort of main central banks. And I think that Bernanke is suggesting that the Bank of England moves towards what you want. And I'm in favor of that. I'm not criticizing what you do at all. I think that what you do is much better. Where I think that you need to be careful is that I think that some of your criticisms of what the non-FPAS central banks have been doing are somewhat overstated. I think that they understand many of the weaknesses that you pointed out. And I hope that they will move towards you, because I think that what you're doing is better than what they're doing. But I would warn you, don't go out of your way to criticize them, because I think that that will only put their backs up. I think that the Bernanke people are moving in your direction, because I think that that is the right thing to do. And I think that you have done extraordinarily well over the years in developing the whole process. And I think that you're ahead of the pack. But you're not necessarily going to make friends and influence people by telling them how awful they are.
I wasn't trying to do that. It was more trying to help them overcome issues that the FS central banks have overcome.
Bernanke, and build on Bernanke. And Bernanke and show how your approach would do what Bernanke wants and what he doesn't actually spell out in any detail.
Okay, good. So maybe we can return back, Shelva, to actual inflation and what is going on now. Shelva, maybe you could start off by, like Charles gave some really nice remarks about how the forces of globalization have gone into reverse, how commodity prices could surprise on the upside because of climate change. I'm thinking about these as proximate causes and so on, like forces like during the Great Moderation, we had very good outcomes in terms of downward inflationary forces because of China, because they had an abundant source of labor from Latin America, helping to build the construction sector. So those forces that were disinflationary allowed the Fed and other central banks to have really low interest rates, really low unemployment, high growth, and so on. And so, Shelva, what are your views about the outlook for inflation, and how would you explain those types of scenarios in terms of Mark II, or the prudent risk management approach to monetary policy.
Okay, thanks. So I think let me offer my views in a nutshell, and let me expand later. So I think these all the forces that you mentioned, these forces that Charles mentioned, is indeed very much important now, which can push inflation above target persistently. And just as much as when inflation was below the target persistently after the global financial crisis, and then we came to a realization that planning to overshoot inflation in the forecast horizon, committing to this temporary overshoot of inflation, was a way to somehow loosen real interest rates. In the same spirit, I think it can be considered to somehow target temporarily undershooting inflation target. That's something that I have not heard much from advanced central banks, but that's probably something worth discussing. And let me expand on this why. So if we look at the degree of tightening that we have been facing, there are 2 points, like how much tightening we need today, and where is this benchmark that we are comparing our tightness to, and which is like a neutral interest rate. This neutral interest rate is probably higher than we thought, like last year, or even before, for like many different reasons. Like for instance, fiscal policy being much more accommodative than we expected a couple of years ago. It means that there are more outstanding domestic currency debt that has to be absorbed by the financial market, and then they may require some higher term premium for that. There is also some this kind of deglobalization or globalization that you mentioned that can also have some implications even for the demand on U.S. treasuries. For instance, this kind of a trade war between U.S. and China can have some implications on how much China holds these U.S. treasuries, and if there is a less demand, that will also push risk premium, term premium up. And because of these reasons, there is of course there is a big uncertainty where the long-term interest rates will go. But if we're talking about risks, it seems that risks are tilted to upwards. That's the benchmark. Benchmark being higher means that there's a risk that we may not be as tight as we thought we are. And the other part is how much tight we need to be. And going back to this, like a desirability of targeting for inflation to undershoot temporarily, that means that we should be tighter today relative to the stance of monetary policy that only guarantees like asymptotic return to the inflation target. Because of these reasons, there is something that we need to be mindful about, the degree of the level of the interest rates that we see today. And because of these risks, both because of the neutral interest rate and because of the tightening that we need today, because inflation has been persistently high, because of many other reasons. Of course, there are some reasons to believe that inflation will revert back to the target pretty easily. Some have argued that this bank lending tightening has been enough, and it's still yet to kick in into the real economy and inflation. So because of these monetary policy lags, we are still to see this disinflation, or some even have some strong opinions that like seasonality adjustments distort inflation figures, and inflation is kind of already weak. But of course, if there were clear signs that inflation is too high, it would be an easy call. That would make policy making much easier. But exactly because we have these different forces on both directions, that's where uncertainty is coming from. That's why we need to be mindful of the risks. And when we talk about risks, then this is the difficulty, and this is where this Mark II comes in, this risk management approach. So looking at which side of the distribution has heavier like a part, which part of the risk is more important, and how to react to it. And if we have a baseline inflation forecast, or there's a market expectation that inflation converges to the target asymptotically, and that's our kind of a base case or most likely outcome, and then policymakers sees that the risk of inflation stacking higher is higher than the risk of inflation coming below target, or even if the distribution is balanced but the risk tolerance is asymmetric, saying that policymakers want to avoid higher like inflation stacking stacking at a higher level for longer, because they might fear episodes like inflation scare where long-term interest rates shoot up and create some debt sustainability problems. Because of this dark corner, policymakers may want to avoid this. So this can also lead to policymakers favoring a path of inflation that's below what's currently expected by the market. And if currently expected is that inflation goes back to the target, and we want to have a lower than that, it mechanically means that risk from a risk management perspective, it can be desirable to target inflation below target, of course, temporarily. Just as much as it made like a perfect sense to target higher than 2% inflation temporarily when inflation was running persistently below target after the global financial crisis. So communicating this is very hard. And that's where these principles of FPAS Mark II come in, to have a structured framework where you communicate, like let alone communicating your reaction function in a linear case. Imagine how difficult it is to communicate your reaction function in terms of like whole distribution of outcomes. But so of course, that's the difficulty, but that's the reality we live in, and we have to adjust. And this kind of a least regrets policy is kind of a one step towards like an improvement towards that direction. If you ask advanced central bank policymakers, I've seen that they emphasize risk management approach. That's not something that they disagree with. Actually, they frequently emphasize, even the Fed officials have said frequently that they follow risk management approach, but how to communicate, how to explain what is the implication of following risk management approach. That's the challenge. And for instance, the same, we're coming back to the same point. What kind of inflation outlook is consistent with the Fed's risk management approach? They have not publicly communicated any kind of a tendency or desirability to temporarily undershoot inflation below 2%. But mechanically, that's what risk management would dictate in this environment. If inflation going back to target asymptotically is too risky because upside risks outweigh, then mechanically it means that in the base case, in the most likely case, inflation has to undershoot target so that the distribution becomes more balanced, about 2%. I think that this having explicit framework that deals with uncertainty, deals with communicating these kind of different scenarios and communicating how risk management is actually applied in practice, that's something that we need to work on.
So I would like to ask the students if they have some questions and stuff for Charles and Shelva. Otherwise, I would like to thank Charles, and as always, give him the last word. We are so grateful that he joins us from time to time, and honored that he gives his feedback and so on. And the comments that he made today, are duly noted. We will try to be positive about everything going forward. So thank you, Charles, for the comments as usual, and thanks, Shelva.
It was a pleasure, and I thought that what Shelva was saying was extremely sensible. And I would like to end just by saying that I do think, Doug, that you are doing exactly the right thing. But don't criticize the others too much. It won't help you.
Okay, good. We will try to be as objective as possible and simply just point out work on things like endogenous policy credibility is not new. We've been doing it for 30 years. I hope they won't take that as a criticism, but that is the reality.
That's absolutely right. It's not. That's objective and straightforward. It's not it's only implicitly a criticism. First of all, that they didn't know, and secondly, that they didn't do anything about it. But I mean, to say that it's been done, you repeat that, and it's fine. Anyhow, I'm getting tired and I'm old, so I'm going to head off. And Shalva, I thought what you were saying throughout was absolutely right. So well done.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Cheers.
guys.
Bye.
Bye.
See you.